Well, welcome to another episode of Anomalies. This is a program about things out of the corner of one's eye, about that which is hidden in the shadows, about the edges of reality. I'm Dan Hall from the Olympia Paranormal Research Group, and I'm joined by my broadcast partner, Dave Jinks. Dave, how are you doing
Hi
today?
there, Dan. Great. How are you doing
Good.
tonight?
I'm doing well.
Looking forward to a good conversation here, as usual.
Right. And I think it's going to be about a topic that we oftentimes speak of outside of these podcasts, and that is the UFO phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
And what that might mean in terms of what our government knows about the UFO phenomena, what it's willing to share, if anything. So that might be the kind of starting question tonight. My sense is that if you're looking at the evidence, there is evidence that this planet is being visited by beings from other worlds. And I mean, that presupposes some things, obviously, that we're not the only intelligent life form in the universe. And if you look back at Project Blue Book and some of the other attempts by our government to chronicle UFO sightings, of course, they had some explanations. A lot of them were the planet Venus and, just naturally occurring phenomena. But there was a certain segment of that population reports that they couldn't explain away by natural phenomena. And that might be the starting point for this discussion about disclosure. Do you have any doubts in your mind that we have been visited by craft or beings, or however you want to explain it, that are not of Earth, that are from someplace else?
Personally, I have very little doubt that UFOs are a real phenomenon, so far unexplained. Now, what that means in reality, I don't know. But I think there's definitely a program of suppression by world governments. There's an obvious pattern of attempted suppression that sometimes is not even very well hidden, the motivations by governmental agencies and entities. And I think looking at the totality of the evidence as presented by people like Timothy Good, Jim Marrs, Richard Dolan especially, is one of my favorites. You're hard pressed to come to any conclusion other than that the phenomenon is real, and for some reason it needs to be hidden. I guess we can speculate about some of those reasons, the motivations for suppressing the evidence, but at the same time, there is a sort of a time-release aspirin program going on. I know that you believe the same thing as far as an indoctrination of the public in general in letting this information trickle out. There's not a complete lid, put on the phenomenon. There's always these little pieces of things that come out that hang out there, and there's always just enough to keep the investigators busy, but there's never enough force a conclusion that that we can all agree on. So it's very complicated and frustrating, in other words. And so our discussion, when we perhaps talk about disclosure tonight, even that is pretty hard to define, as we've talked about in preparing for this podcast. It's what is disclosure? What would it look like? Will it ever happen? And if so, when? What will things look like after disclosure? Who might be the one who discloses? All those sorts of questions I think that we can get into. But we really have to agree upon what disclosure is. If we agree that the UFO phenomenon is, a true thing, not an imagined thing. I think you and I can agree on that.
Right, and you mentioned some authors that are particularly persuasive for those who might be listening to this podcast and saying, everything is identifiable as the planet Venus. Mm-hmm. There's no possibility that we're being visited by beings from other worlds. One of those authors that I would highly recommend, I recommend all of them, but his approach is such so that his writing style is from the standpoint of, hey, the aliens are here. They've been here for a long time, and we just need to recognize that. And that's Jim Marrs' book, The Alien Agenda. Mm-hmm. I think that's a superlative chronology of contacts that people from Earth have had with unidentified flying objects, but not just objects that have been misidentified natural phenomena, that some of these objects do things that our science can't explain. And Jim Marshall's approach to this is that there is in fact an alien agenda out there. So I guess that kind of, if you can get past the, are there beings from other planets visiting us, then you can kind of get to the notion of, is our government going to let us know about that? What are the dangers of letting us know about that? What does disclosure mean? Some of those things that you talked about. So when you let's deal with the kind of, it seems like a basic question about disclosure. If there are beings from other planets with superior technology visiting Earth, would it be in the best interest of the United States government or the governments of the world to even acknowledge that?
Well, I think clearly no, the answer is, from the perspective of, from the official perspective, from a bureaucratic perspective, because what a government seeks is to limit any sort of unpredictability among its populace, of course. Things work better if you can predict what's going to happen next, at least within some range. And admission, and say we're calling disclosure an official admission by a government or an entity that UFOs represent real craft under intelligent control. That sort of admission right there opens the door to total and utter chaos in any sort of analysis, I believe. And we've talked about the Brookings Institution report,
right,
which was presented to the 59th, the 60th Congress. I mean, it's been a number of decades since. But that report in itself, which was never followed up, even though it was recommended to have follow-up, studies based on that initial one, it was pretty shocking in its conclusions, or at least very earth-shaking, even in the few things that it did admit. And it basically said that we should consider suppressing information. That's kind of what it concluded, knowing that societies can literally disintegrate when confronted with something so earth-shattering as a different intelligence, the presence of a different intelligence, and the collision that would occur between our nice insulated world and something that would be completely unknown, like an alien intelligence especially.
So I can't remember if I've ever read the Brookings Institution study in its entirety, but I've certainly seen a summary of it and heard people talk about it. Mm-hmm. So what would be, and we'll kind of use that as a basis for this question, what would be some of the reasons that chaos would ensue? What about an acknowledgement by our government or governments of the world that there is an alien presence with superior technology than what we have? What would be disruptive or chaotic about that?
I suppose a better question would be what would not be disrupted by that sort of revelation. And, depending on the level of advancement of the intelligence behind that technology, speaking only in terms of technology, that's not even to mention the spiritual or mental capacity of such an intelligence, colliding with our humble human intelligence. It may turn out to be that way if this civilization is millions of years advanced of ours. So the things that would be affected, obviously, pretty much run the table.
Well, the first thing I think of is national security. Mm-hmm. If so many of these UFO reports, credible UFO reports, that technology showed some kind of superiority in terms of its ability to control our own technology. I'm thinking about that one case at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana that happened, I'm guessing it might have been the 70s, I'm not real clear about the date, but some kind of UFO activity over an intercontinental ballistic missile base in Montana resulted in the ICBMs becoming non-operational. They just went dead. And if you interpret that as the ability of whatever that unidentified flying object was, or the occupants of that unidentified flying object whoever they were, if there were occupants. That's a pretty frightening technology from a national security standpoint, because not only could that, at that point in time, affect the balance of power in the world between nations that had ICBMs, but if you perceive the UFOs as a threat, then they can disable your best weapons. So why would you admit to that? Or I'm just thinking the panic that could ensue from people, the general public, when they thought, well, our military can't protect us because whatever our weapons that we could use against these UFO occupants would be rendered useless. So that's a big one to me.
Well, I have read the Brookings report. It's not that big, but what it says is, you know, pretty potent. You read it and they did give a lot of thought. There were some 200 scientists, I think, involved, and Margaret Mead is the famous anthropologist. Yeah. She had input, and interestingly, they focused on religious groups. Right. They said that religious groups would be devastated by the revelation that other intelligences existed out there, sort of knocking humans off of their pedestal, I suppose, was their argument.
So God wouldn't necessarily look like a human. It could look like a insectoid kind of creature. God
may be an alien,
right?
But humans also perhaps aren't the chosen ones if aliens are spread across the universe. So that was one thing that the Brookings report focused on. The other thing was that they surprisingly sort of turned the spotlight onto themselves, and they said scientists would have their apple carts upset by such a revelation because they realized that they didn't know so much. They may be inferior.
They got it wrong.
Knowledge. They got things wrong. They were not as smart as the other intelligences. But I think what you just said in terms of the government motivation for not disclosing, I think you hit the nail right on the head, and that is that we can all agree, however much we like or dislike government, that the government's main function is to protect, especially in a post 9/11 world. Unfortunately, we really, I think, lean too much on the whole security thing. It's like, how much liberty do we give up to get more security from our government and our military-industrial complex? But especially in this day and age, that is a function that we all expect of the government. So just having a flat-out admission that, no, we can't stop these guys from turning our missile controls off. And there are several cases of that, too. The one you mentioned, I think, is the most famous. But, you know, that's not the sort of admission a government will ever make willingly, I don't believe. So that argument, that fact alone is an argument against disclosure ever happening in an official capacity. So, you know, there's a lot of discussion about when is disclosure going to happen, who will disclose, what are the different scenarios that it might happen under. I know Richard Dolan, we mentioned him a few minutes ago, he has an entire book called After Disclosure, and he goes into minute, almost comical detail on some of the things. He examines what would happen after disclosure as far as the legal system, you know. Who will we sue, you know, upon learning that aliens exist? And, you know, you read that at first, you kind of laugh. It's like, who cares about what laws may have been broken or not in the face of such a giant discovery? But, you know, civilization must go on Earth, and that will be something that humans will have to take into account. Is that who was wronged during this suppression, and who needs to be sued, because that seems to be what people do these days when there's a perceived wrong. And, you know, of course, some of it's justified, but in this case, of course, the government is not going to be able to avoid the accusations that they covered this up for literally decades, and who was wronged because of that. I mean, that's a huge thing that the government will have to deal with, that sort of blowback. You know, the people who do trust the government still, I'm sure there's some out there who still trust the military-industrial complex, although, you know,
Doesn't seem very trustworthy, does it?
There's lots of reasons not to, but you lose the faith of those people too, and you've got a big mess on your hands if you're a government who's still trying to promise and promote security for its citizens. And so that you brought up is a gigantic consideration for those who continue the cover-up.
Well, and when I was thinking about this issue of security, sure, there's national security involved, but I guess I think back to, because I was looking at his name and some of his work the other day, Bud Hopkins, who wrote about the alien abduction phenomenon. Now, that's pretty far out in some people's purviews, but still it's related to the UFO phenomenon because the abductions are being done by people in these UFOs. That's on a much more personal level. If you could not be secure in your own home, or you could not be secure in your bed at night from some kind of strange creature coming, and if you read some of the accounts in Intruders, Bud Hopkins' account of some of those alien abductions, there's some pretty strange things that happen. People floated out their windows at night, kind of defying gravity. People kind of living in fear of being abducted, generational abductions of people. I mean, that seems, national security is one issue, but it seems like your own personal security would be certainly at risk if it were known that these, the alien abduction phenomena and the UFOs that are related to it were describing something that's actually happened to people.
And imagine, somebody discovering that the agencies, the U.S. government, as well as other agencies in other countries, have actively covered up the existence of UFOs and potentially the occupants or the related alien and abduction phenomena. That's pretty good grounds for a lawsuit right there, I think.
Really?
And so we talk about this fascinating and earth-shattering revelation of other intelligence in the universe, and yet we still come down to our human structure that we've built here, our society. I guess you really do have to consider those sorts of things in a post-disclosure world. And again, Richard Dolan has written brilliantly about these subjects, so we'd refer readers to his new book about the nitty-gritty of what would happen after disclosure. I think that we can talk about some of that, but I was hoping we'd talk about maybe how it could come about, whether it ever will come about, and what some of the motivations are for disclosing and not disclosing.
Well, one thing, and I think it's related to the direction you want to go in, would be a counter-argument to the reason not to disclose that was articulated in the Brookings Institute study is the notion that happened back in the 50s, and through popular culture, and you hear, it's almost like there's some kind of conspiratorial collaboration between the government and the aliens or whatever, but through popular culture, and I'm thinking of movies particularly like E.T., Close Encounters of the Third Kind, that even though there were some other dire consequences predicted in the Brookings study, that today we've been kind of desensitized to some of those by the widespread visibility of the notion that there are aliens, and sometimes friendly aliens. I'm thinking of E.T. and the extraterrestrial. Do you think that has muddied the issue of disclosure, that possibly, and maybe that's just a part of disclosure, that's a desensitization to the more traumatic parts of disclosure by exposing us ahead of time, so when and if disclosure happens, it won't be all that big a deal. What do you think? What do you think about that?
I think that gets pretty complicated. I think when you look at the wide variety of media representations of alien intelligence, that there hasn't been a very comprehensive or cohesive message. It's kind of all over the board. And so it's pretty hard to argue that there's a central driving force behind it, like there's some coordinated effort to present a certain image and indoctrination program. Now, I think that governments have allowed stuff to trickle out as far as certain incidents. They did, like you mentioned, the Blue Book study. They could have just not done anything at all, but they went to the trouble to at least look at the phenomenon, and at least they're reacting to public demands in some cases instead of just completely not addressing the issue at all.
But is there a reaction, and maybe this is kind of an indication of where disclosure would go, is there a reaction to public demand that some of this stuff be studied at all genuine? What I'm thinking of is not so much Project Blue Book, but another attempt by a so-called disinterested third party. I'm thinking of the Condon Commission that was chaired by the professor Condon at, I believe, University of Colorado. Mm-hmm. That was supposedly going to be an objective look into the UFO phenomena. And the backstory with that whole investigation was that Condon pretty much stated from the get-go that there wouldn't be any kind of objective investigation, and that essentially wrote the conclusions for the report prior to the investigation even being held. So I don't know. Is that a statement about, well, if they're going to treat it that way, then it's very unlikely that there ever be any kind of legitimate inquiry?
Yeah, that again, it's hard to tell whether that was just pure scientific bias or if it was an intentional program by the government or some faction of the government who wanted to get out ahead of the story and debunk, and we're always kind of battling between those two choices, it seems like. It's just hard to tell because I think there are several different motivations kind of at odds with each other in most of these cases. And I think that serves the overall purpose I think that serves the overall purpose of those in the government who wish to keep the cover-up going for as long as possible, because there's always that confusion. It knocks the investigators off the trail. It keeps the scientists out because there's always that giggle factor involved. Nobody serious does it, and so why should I get involved?
Well, which to me begs the whole question of disclosure. I mean, we talk about what form would disclosure take. Well, would anybody take disclosure seriously? Because we have so many examples in dealing with unusual phenomena of where there's a disinformation campaign. Mm-hmm. So that one hoax or one prefabricated story is essentially used to debunk all information of the same sort. So short of the proverbial landing on the White House lawn, mm-hmm. where Obama or who's ever president comes out and introduces the ETs, wouldn't anybody be just likely to say, well, that's probably a hoax?
Yeah, and as long as you brought that up, I guess we could go through the disclosure scenarios, which, the prototypical one is the presidential address or a UN address, and it's where the president walks up to the podium in a national audience and calls a press conference, and everyone is glued to the TV or the radio or their mobile phone or whatever watching the address where Obama or whoever it is gets up and says, I've got an important announcement that will change history, and we are here to admit that we have visitors, basically, that the so-called UFOs are actually physical craft under an intelligent control. He may or may not utter the words extraterrestrial or alien, but even the admission that UFOs exist as a physical entity, or at least sometimes physical, would be a huge revelation. So the different disclosure scenarios would lead to different results. Obviously, that one would be a more orderly sort of progression of realization by the population, as opposed to a complete chaotic sort of response, which might happen with the alien landing on the White House lawn.
Aliens introducing themselves.
That's it. Aliens could introduce themselves. That's a whole other ballgame, unless it was in coordination with a prepared unveiling or landing or something, which of course would bring up lots of other questions, as in in particular, did we know we had aliens here before? It's right. Like all of a sudden we're showcasing our alien friends.
So does that admit to a certain degree of governmental vulnerability? because it seems like whether it's Obama or Obama plus the ambassador from Zeta Reticuli or giving the speech, does beg the question, well, how long have you known about this?
Right.
And if you've hidden that from us, if you've known about it for a long time and just haven't shared that with us, what does that say about the relationship between the government and its people, you know?
Right. It would pretty much blow up all trust that. And I think that, again, as you mentioned at the very beginning of the discussion here, is what governments fear the most, is that even if they're dying to disclose out of the goodness of their hearts or other motives, the natural consequence of that admission is, yes, we've been lying to you for at least 60 years, but it was for your own good.
Right.
And some people might buy that, but most of us, would realize right off the bat that something has gone very wrong, and now we have to deal with not only the government being as wrong as we always suspected it
but worse.
but now that we've got alien visitors who happen to be able to disable our most powerful weapons. So you can sympathize with the devil, in this case the government. How would you, if you were in a power position, how would you ever hope to have an orderly transition? And I think that their approach has been, again, the time-release aspirin, to let stuff trickle out. We'll kind of pretend to debunk things, but not quite. We'll let it unfold. We'll let, the aliens do their various appearances, and maybe there's an agreement. Who knows? You read some of these books, I don't know, did you mention Timothy Good? I think gets into that a little bit, although he's hesitant to go there because that gets pretty messy. Alliances between the government and the aliens, that's going pretty far.
I was going to say,
and
if there's
Jim Mars, I think,
ever a ground to sue somebody, it would be just
Right.
that the aliens and the humans have colluded in some respects.
So, would you go to the Brookings Report again for guidance, and you seek to suppress again to prevent chaos coming from the religious groups or whatever group you think is going to freak out the most? Or and I think this may be what maybe the de facto disclosure scenario is that more and more insiders, as they reach their deathbeds,
talk about things.
They come out and they're more and more credible, with less and less to gain from making some of these disclosures themselves. And does that at some point reach a critical mass where enough people go, there's just so many people that are saying the same thing that I'm starting to really suspect something? And that takes you to, say, the Disclosure Project by Stephen Greer and his 200, 300 witnesses, or whatever it's up to.
And are you specifically talking about the National Press Club news conference that he gave, where he, I mean, that's part of it. That's not the whole project.
Yeah.
But he paraded a number of very credible witnesses out there to the national press, saying, hey, we think that they're extraterrestrials. We've had contacts with them.
And, that may be what the people perpetrating the cover-up have decided is the best route. There's not going to be any overt disclosure. It's just going to be this continuous trickle of insiders saying, I'm breaking my security oath, or my oath is up, or I don't care anymore. I'm going to tell you what I participated in at Groom Lake or whatever. And that leads me into something I wanted to talk about as far as one of those Disclosure Project witnesses, and that's Carol Rosin. I don't know if we talked about her.
Name sounds familiar.
In a prior podcast, but she was the confidant of Wernher von Braun, who was the father of modern rocketry. Basically, he was a Nazi party member who came over in Operation Paperclip. Now, he says he was not a Nazi, but he had to join the party in order to continue his work in rocketry. So, giving him the benefit of the doubt, whatever the case, he came from Germany to be an integral part of the United States space program. And Carol, I believe it's Rosin or Rosen, I think it's Rosin, she was with von Braun for the last 4 years of his life, and as he lay dying of cancer, literally on his deathbed until he died, he told Carol Rosin that she had to, on his behalf, put an end to the push to put weapons in space. And he said that the reason for this, and Rosin was in a position to, have impact that way because she was the first woman CEO of an aerospace company, which is no small feat. Obviously, particularly for a woman, she was the head of Fairchild Industries. And the reason, and I have some of what Carol Rosin testified here. I was just going to read a little bit about it because it's very interesting what she says he told her. So let me just go over this. She said what was most interesting to me with her relationship with von Braun was he said that there was a strategy in place that was being used to educate the public. Scare tactics. He says that the strategy that von Braun taught me was that first the Russians were going to be considered to be the enemy. And in fact, in 1974, when he was saying this, they, of course, were the enemy. The commies were coming to get us, that they had killer satellites. And of course, they were, if anyone was ahead of the U.S. in the space race, it was the Russians. So they were a very formidable opponent at that point. He said the next step, though, would be terrorists that would soon follow. Then they were going to identify third world crazies. We now call them nations of concern, or rogue nations.
Libya,
Iran, obviously the whole Middle East in one way or another has been categorized as a terrorist state or a rogue nation. Or the enemy after that would be asteroids. And Carol said this was always funny because back in 1974, we didn't know about near-Earth asteroids. We didn't have satellites up there detecting asteroids. She said that he said this is the excuse that we were going to use to build space-based weapons. And she said, and the funniest one of all was that after the asteroid threat, what would come next would be the aliens or extraterrestrials. And that would be the final scare, he told her over and over. She said during those 4 years, he'd bring up that last card, the extraterrestrial card, and he would say, and remember, Carol, the last card is the alien card. We're going to have to build space-based weapons against aliens, and all of it is a lie. She said the last card, the extraterrestrial enemy card, and he would tell her with intensity which was so deep that it made her realize there were more details he was afraid to mention. So even on his deathbed, he was too afraid to talk about the details that accompanied that last card, the extraterrestrial threat. So if it's true what the father of modern rocketry said till his dying days, there is already a program in place which would kind of make moot the various disclosure scenarios we're looking at, because I think there may just be one scenario that is going to happen. And I think, unfortunately, it's going to be not a benevolent disclosure. It's going to be used in a sense that generates fear and control for the people who've already been in control. So I'll pass it back to you on that subject.
Well,
let you
ponder
that for a minute.
That brings up a couple of different things. It's almost like what Carol Rosin was talking about is a darker version of the idea I advanced earlier about that somehow you use cultural media or cultural stories, use the American culture to desensitize people to aliens. Except this isn't exposing one to E.T. the extraterrestrial. This is exposing someone to a threat. If I get what Carol Rosin was talking about, or what Wernher von Braun was talking about through Carol Rosin, though, this seems to be a discussion apart from disclosure in a way, because it seems like what von Braun was talking about is a motive by the United States government to assume more and more control through fear, and that really aliens are kind of a straw man in this whole debate. I don't know. Do you see that? So it's maybe not really about disclosure about what we're talking about or what we started this discussion with. It's more about another strategy to maintain power by people who enjoy being in power.
And I think it's a somewhat evil mix of knowing that they can't suppress it forever, and that eventually it's going to come out, whether through, as we discussed, the insiders reaching a critical mass where most people go, there's just something here. A mix of that plus the desire to finally let it be out in the open and let the chips fall where they may, which is more of a benevolent evolutionary thing. We need to let it happen. There's got to be somebody in there who thinks that way. They may be in the minority, maybe most of them think, how can we use this to our advantage and gain yet a bigger share of the black budgets and, control of whatever they already control, the military-industrial complex.
Well, I know I want to take us in one other direction about possible formats for disclosure, and I've got a famous phrase for you that I think will introduce this, and the phrase would be Gort Klatu Verata Niktu. And if you remember that phrase, that's from a movie that both you and I really enjoyed, at least the original one I did back in the 50s. I'm not so sure about the Keanu Reeves remake, but The Day the Earth Stood Still with Michael Rennie. Now, what if disclosure literally does mean that, in that one of the first scenes in that movie, you find a spaceship landing on the mall in Washington D.C. and Michael Rennie comes out, and this superhuman robot Gort comes out. What if that's our disclosure, where our government's not really necessarily equipped to deal with it? And maybe what will happen then, I mean, if you looked at the movie, the plot line there, as soon as Michael Rennie shows up, and before he reveals himself to be human, and the people take one look at Gort, the first response there is to shoot first and ask questions later. So what if that's disclosure? If there's just a dramatic UFO event that gets widespread coverage that the government really doesn't maybe even respond well to, So what does that do to disclosure? Is that...
Well, if my view is one of the... I'm most convinced or compelled by the Wernher von Braun scenario. And I think that, what you described, would fit into it. An event that was so big and so well seen and witnessed that you couldn't deny it.
But I think the problem, though, with the Wernher von Braun perspective is that if that Michael Rennie scene was actually played out, rather than to give the government more control, it would have the opposite effect. It would be such an awesome, an explosive event that might reveal the government to be totally helpless in terms of responding to some kind of extraterrestrial threat. So that might kind of backfire in some respects.
Well, I suppose, although it would depend completely on the official governmental response to that. It's like, okay, we want to negotiate with you and be peaceful and all. Now, if that was the response, then people may go, yeah, you may have to be one of those people holding up the sign saying, I, for one, welcome our alien overlords, or you got to choose your side at that point. But if the government, the good old U.S. government, puts up a big fight, as we all expect as Americans, then surely we will go for anything, pay any project, spend any amount of money, shovel any amount of dollars towards the military-industrial complex that we have, which is already as big as the world combined in this country. And the sky's truly the limit. I mean, we thought after 9/11 that, a blank check to the military. Just imagine what it would be after, an appearance by an alien who had any hint of a threat behind it.
Well, and Dave, that's an intriguing part of this to me, because it seems like, maybe going back to the basis of this discussion, what would disclosure look like? Will we have disclosure? Maybe at the heart of that question, or those questions, would be our view of who the aliens are. If we perceive them as a threat, that leads to one kind of scenario for disclosure. But if we don't view them as a threat, if we view them as somehow collaborators, even though they might have technology far superior to us, it seems like we're going to handle disclosure in different ways based on how we view the aliens. A threat versus an opportunity.
Yeah, and you have to kind of, again, referring to popular culture, you look at a movie like Contact, Carl Sagan's sort of parting shot to popular culture, which was different from what he talked about before, having been more the skeptic, played more skeptical roles. This one, he said, how to react to alien intelligence? Would it be like the cult group? I don't know. I'm sure you saw that at some point. It's been a number of years since I've seen it.
I just watched Contact the other
really?
day. Yeah.
But the crazy cult leader, are we going to react that way, or are we going to react in an evolved way, feeling as if we're somehow at an equal level to the aliens, or even able to interact or have confidence in our government to interact with the aliens. So there'll be a wide variety of responses within the citizenry, of course, too. So it just depends on which way the majority will go. Unfortunately, I would guess in our country that it's going to be shoot first, ask questions later, and that's going to be the initial response, regardless of how it is presented, and especially if it's presented from the alien perspective. Yes, there will be the cult, praising the aliens as our new gods, but most of us will be brandishing weapons and pitchforks and torches, and either alternately burning down the White House because they didn't protect us, and then attacking the alien threat on the other hand.
I mean, one of the thoughts that comes to mind about that is we're talking about disclosure from a human perspective, but maybe what if disclosure doesn't come about because of something we do, and maybe this is more like Michael Rennie landing at the Washington Mall. Maybe disclosure is something that's going to be triggered by those intelligent occupants of UFOs. And you talked about evolution here a minute, and I think we can probably quibble about how evolved we are as a species. Certainly there are things that we've advanced in, but humanity has kind of a nasty nature to it too. But maybe the aliens have purposely not revealed themselves through some kind of disclosure because of their feeling that we can't handle it. They don't need the Brookings. We don't need the Brookings Institute to tell us we can't handle it. The aliens, if they've been coming here as often as we suppose, and with this planet, is in some people's senses, has been under observation or surveillance for a long time, they may just say we'd be nuts to reveal ourselves at this point in time because this human species isn't evolved enough. And I realize when I'm saying that, it's almost like one of the problems with thinking about how aliens think is you really can't think about how they think because they're aliens. Our perspectives might be totally irrelevant to what their thought process might be.
Yeah, and I think what you just outlined is my conclusion after having looked at this for close to 20 years now, in that from the alien perspective, as best as we can gather, they probably are in an observation role. Essentially, we're animals in a zoo because we are confined to our planet. We're not leaving it anytime soon. And just like all good scientists who study nature, among humans studying other species, we don't insert ourselves into the equation. We go out of the way to not be part of the experiment. So
there's that observer effect that you have to insulate against.
And so it makes perfect sense if this is an intelligent species or different races observing, and they're probably different. Once you admit to one, you might as well open the door to multiple and potentially dozens, who are here with different motivations. But the one thing we know for sure is that they have not decided to disclose themselves in a very obvious way. It's been selective contacts. It may be a case of cumulative contacts to the point where we reach some sort of critical mass as humans and are able to handle a transition. So it's been going on for decades, who knows, at least 60 years, seriously, since we developed nuclear weapons, and probably for hundreds or thousands. The intelligence has been here observing. So I don't think the, quote, aliens are interested in overt disclosure. They probably resist that and have no motivation whatsoever. And I don't think the military industrial complex has any desire to expose their complicity in the cover-up, and the governments have no real incentive to participate in any overt disclosure either. So when people ask, when will it happen, the answer might as well be it won't, unless there's some overriding benefit from one of those groups that I just mentioned to disclose. And as I said, my belief is that the only benefit would be a non-benevolent one. It would be a power grab, and it would be something like what von Braun outlined, in that it would be, designed to increase the fear, increase the control, and it could be a fake, alien landing, or a hologram, a giant Independence Day-like ship floating, so that you can guarantee to get everybody scared together, and that's when you introduce your savior, whoever that might be. I mean, that opens up all sorts of real interesting scenarios, but maybe I'm just pessimistic, but that makes the most sense to me because of the fact that it hasn't happened yet, and I think the time when it would have been a benevolent action has long passed. I mean, it would have been 50 years ago if the intentions were to just, gather some information, get your ducks in a row, and then let everyone know, and let's grow together knowing that there's this presence. Well, that time has passed.
Yeah, as we kind of wind down this discussion, I certainly have come to the conclusion that disclosure is not in the interest of a lot of the parties involved. Mm-hmm. So it's like, maybe that's just in some of these paranormal topics that we talked about, there seems to be a mythology that goes along with them. And in some respects, the mythology is put in place to inoculate one group or insulate one group from some kind of negative effect. Maybe disclosure doesn't serve anybody's purposes other than people like you and I who are looking for more truth than we're finding from our government, or more truth about the real world. Maybe what we ought to do at the end of this podcast is, give out our individual phone numbers and hope that the ETs will contact us personally for some kind of disclosure, because it seems like from a societal, we just have a bunch of nutcases.
Well, then we're in a position, assume the ETs took us up on our challenge there, and then we find ourselves in the position of the very people that we are criticizing.
Yeah. We have the same moral dilemmas. Yeah,
how do you disclose things to your young children? Mm-hmm. You don't tell them 90% of what you have learned about the world because you want to protect them.
Right.
You want to give them a chance to grow and come to their own conclusions about those things rather than specifically tell them. So,
and maybe in that respect, our frustration with the government not being willing to disclose what they know about the UFO phenomena, we could best understand that if you view the government in a paternal role, that we must, for our own good, we must be kept safe, or certain things must be kept from us in order for us to be able to function and have some kind of stability in our world. Well, like a lot of the topics we discuss, the questions, sometimes there are more questions that arise in the discussion than there are answers. But I think this is the important topic to discuss, because only someone who would be blind to the evidence would suggest that there are no other intelligences in the universe, and that those intelligences have not been visiting Earth, because I think there's a whole body of irrefutable evidence that would say that we have been contacted. The question is, to what degree is that going to become a societal, the awareness of that is going to be on a societal or a governmental level. So I don't know.
And eventually we'll have to deal with it. Maybe not in your lifetime or mine or even our kids, but eventually we will have to deal with the consequences of not being alone. Because I think, as you said, that the body of evidence is such that you can come to no other conclusion than that we exist alongside other intelligences. And eventually we're going to have to, accept that into our little human world, our human existence here.
Yeah. Well, but that's a topic for another podcast. Dave, thanks a lot for being here, and we'll talk to you again about another paranormal topic.
Okay, thanks, Dan. We'll look forward to it.
Gort, Latu, Barada, Nikto, Latu, Barada, Nikto.